What if everything fans thought they knew about Michael Jackson's final years was completely wrong? For years, the world watched Michael Jackson through headlines, rumors, and endless controversy. But according to a man who stood just feet away from him during some of the most difficult moments of his life, the truth looked very different behind closed doors. Michael Jackson's former bodyguard is now revealing details that have left many fans stunned. And it all starts with a moment he says he will never forget: the day of Michael Jackson's funeral. While thousands of grieving fans stood outside mourning the king of pop, the bodyguard claims that something inside the funeral deeply bothered him. He says he watched celebrity after celebrity arrive, many of whom he felt were nowhere to be found when Michael needed real support the most. But among all the famous faces, one name stood out: Chris Tucker. According to the bodyguard, Tucker wasn't just another celebrity showing up for the cameras. He describes him as one of the very few people who maintained a genuine friendship with Michael, someone who actually spent time with him away from the spotlight. And that revelation is only the beginning. The bodyguard also opens up about the painful toll years of accusations allegedly took on Michael's life. He describes a man who struggled to find peace, a man who often stayed awake through the night while the rest of the world slept. Instead of resting, Michael would reportedly disappear into his private studio in the early hours of the morning, sometimes at 3 or 4 a.m., working, creating, dancing, and pouring himself into music. Was Michael Jackson one of the most misunderstood figures in entertainment history? And what did those closest to him witness that the public never saw? The answers may change the way you look at Michael Jackson forever. The answers may change the way you look at Michael Jackson forever. Because according to someone who spent years protecting him, the Michael Jackson the world saw on television was not the same Michael Jackson he knew behind closed doors. For decades, millions of people formed opinions about Michael based on headlines, court cases, tabloid stories, and television specials. Every move he made seemed to become international news. Every rumor spread across the globe in a matter of hours. And as the years passed, it became increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction. But Michael's former bodyguard says there was one thing that always frustrated him. He believes most people never truly understood who Michael Jackson was. During a revealing interview, the bodyguard explained that one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding Michael was the idea that the public knew the real man behind the superstar image. According to him, Michael was deeply misunderstood. And he believes that misunderstanding followed Michael for years. The bodyguard recalled how accusations and controversies became attached to Michael's name, creating a cloud that never seemed to completely disappear no matter what happened afterward. Even when legal battles ended, public debates continued. People picked sides. Some believed Michael. Others didn't. And according to the bodyguard, that division never really went away. What made the situation even more personal for him was the fact that people often questioned his own judgment simply because he continued working for Michael. He explained that some individuals could not understand how he could remain loyal to someone surrounded by so much controversy. In fact, he admitted that he lost friendships because of it. Friends questioned why he stayed. Friends questioned what he believed. Friends questioned his decisions. But the bodyguard says his answer never changed. From his perspective, he knew the person he worked with every day. He wasn't judging Michael based on newspaper headlines. He was judging him based on real-life experiences. Based on conversations. Based on years spent observing him up close. And because of that, he developed a very different view from the one many people had formed through media coverage. That difference is exactly why he eventually decided to tell his story. According to him, watching public narratives take over after Michael's death became increasingly difficult. Especially after attending the funeral. The funeral itself was one of the most emotional events in entertainment history. Fans from around the world gathered to pay tribute to the King of Pop. News cameras covered every moment. Celebrities arrived one after another. Tributes poured in. The entire world seemed to stop and reflect on Michael Jackson's impact. But while millions watched the ceremony unfold, the Bodyguard says he was experiencing something completely different. Instead of focusing on the public spectacle, he was focused on the people. Who had really been there? Who had actually spent time with Michael during his hardest moments? Who had supported him when cameras weren't rolling? Those were the questions running through his mind. And according to the Bodyguard, the answers were not always what people expected. That's why one particular name stood out. Chris Tucker. When asked about Michael's genuine friendships, the Bodyguard immediately spoke positively about the comedian and actor. According to him, Chris Tucker was not simply a celebrity acquaintance. He was a real friend. Someone who maintained regular communication with Michael. Someone who actually spent time with him. Someone who visited him. Someone who shared experiences with him away from public events and media attention. The Bodyguard even recalled going to movies with Michael and Chris Tucker. That memory may sound simple. But for those who knew Michael's life, moments like that were rare. Michael Jackson was arguably one of the most recognizable people on the planet. Even ordinary activities could become major events. Going somewhere as simple as a movie theater often required planning, security arrangements, and careful attention. Yet according to the Bodyguard, Chris Tucker was one of the few people genuinely present in those private moments. And that mattered. Because as Michael's fame continued growing, trust became increasingly difficult. Imagine living in a world where almost everyone wanted something from you. Money, access, connections, fame, opportunities. How do you know who truly cares about you? How do you know who is genuine? How do you know who would still be there if all the fame disappeared tomorrow? Those are questions many celebrities face. But few experience that challenge on the level Michael Jackson did. For much of his life, Michael lived under an extraordinary spotlight. Every success became international news. Every mistake became front-page news. Every personal struggle became public discussion. Over time, that kind of attention can change relationships. Some people get closer because they genuinely care. Others get closer because of what they hope to gain. According to the Bodyguard, that reality became obvious throughout Michael's life. And perhaps nowhere was it more visible than after his passing. As tributes filled television screens and public figures spoke about their connections to Michael, the Bodyguard couldn't help comparing those public displays to what he personally witnessed during Michael's life. That's why he says seeing certain things at the funeral bothered him. Not because he didn't believe people respected Michael, but because he knew who had consistently been around and who had not. For him, there was a difference between public admiration and genuine friendship. And that distinction mattered, especially on a day meant to honor Michael's memory. But beyond friendships and public perception, there was another side of Michael's life that the Bodyguard says many people never fully understood. His struggle with sleep. According to the Bodyguard, Michael dealt with significant sleeping problems. And those issues became increasingly noticeable over time. Sleep is something most people take for granted. You get tired. You go to bed. You wake up. But for some individuals, sleep becomes a nightly battle. A frustrating cycle of exhaustion without rest. And according to the Bodyguard, Michael often found himself trapped in that cycle. The former security guard believes the stress surrounding years of accusations and public scrutiny may have contributed to those struggles. Whether he was reading headlines, hearing public criticism, or simply carrying the emotional weight of ongoing controversy, the pressure was enormous. And pressure has a way of following people into the night. Long after cameras stop rolling. Long after interviews end. Long after the world goes quiet. That's when thoughts become louder. That's when worries become harder to ignore. And according to the Bodyguard, Michael often found himself awake during those hours. There were nights when everyone else expected the house to be settling down. Nights when most people would be asleep. Yet Michael was still awake. Still moving. Still creating. Still searching for an outlet. Instead of lying in bed, he would reportedly head toward the studio. Sometimes in the middle of the night. Sometimes at 3 in the morning. Sometimes even later. And when the music started playing, the security team knew exactly what was happening. Michael was awake again. Working. Creating. Escaping into the thing he loved most. Music. For Michael Jackson, music was never just a career. It was part of who he was. And according to those closest to him, it often became a refuge during difficult periods of his life. While the world debated his legacy outside, Michael would retreat into creativity inside. Writing. Thinking. Singing. Dancing. Perfecting ideas. Chasing inspiration. Hour after hour. Night after night. And for the people tasked with protecting him, those late-night studio sessions became a familiar part of life. Because when sleep wouldn't come, Michael Jackson often turned to the one place where he felt most comfortable. The music. For Michael Jackson, music wasn't simply entertainment. It wasn't just a profession. And it certainly wasn't just a way to make money. According to people who spent time around him, music was something much deeper. It was a place where he could escape. A place where the pressure of being Michael Jackson seemed to disappear, even if only for a few hours. That's why those late-night studio sessions became so important. While the rest of the world slept, Michael was often awake, surrounded by mirrors, speakers, notebooks, and endless creative ideas. The Bodyguard described hearing music coming from the studio in the middle of the night. For the security team, that sound became a signal. A signal that Michael wasn't sleeping again. A signal that another restless night had arrived. But instead of letting frustration consume him, Michael reportedly poured his energy into creating. Think about that for a moment. Most people dealing with stress eventually reach a point where they simply shut down. But Michael seemed to do the opposite. The more pressure he faced, the more he immersed himself in his art. And perhaps that's one of the reasons his music continues connecting with people decades later. Because so much of it came from genuine emotion. According to the Bodyguard, Michael truly believed music could heal people. He believed songs could inspire hope. He believed melodies could bring comfort. And he believed entertainment could carry meaningful messages. That's a side of Michael that often gets overshadowed by controversy. When people discuss his life, conversations usually focus on headlines, accusations, investigations, and tabloid stories. But according to those who knew him personally, Michael himself spent far more time thinking about creativity than controversy. He thought about performances. He thought about fans. He thought about music. And perhaps most importantly, he thought about how his work could affect others. The Bodyguard recalled that Michael viewed music almost like a form of medicine. Not medicine in a literal sense, but emotionally, spiritually. A way to help people through difficult moments in their lives. When fans listened to his songs, Michael hoped they would feel something. Hope, comfort, strength, unity. And judging by the millions of people who continue listening to his music today, many would argue he succeeded. Even now, years after his passing, Michael Jackson remains one of the most discussed entertainers in history. His songs continue streaming. His performances continue being studied. His influence continues shaping new generations of artists. And perhaps that's exactly what fascinates people the most. How does someone remain so relevant so many years later? Part of the answer may lie in the emotional connection people formed with his work. Because regardless of public debates, Michael created music that became part of people's lives. Songs played at weddings. Songs played during celebrations. Songs played during difficult times. Songs that became memories. And memories are powerful. They last. They survive long after headlines disappear. Yet despite all of that success, the Bodyguard suggests that Michael carried emotional burdens many people never fully appreciated. Imagine being one of the most famous people in the world. Imagine having millions of fans. Imagine selling records across every continent. Imagine performing in front of massive crowds. Now imagine still feeling misunderstood. That's the contradiction the Bodyguard believes Michael lived with. To the public, he seemed larger than life. But privately, he was still a human being dealing with criticism, stress, and uncertainty. The accusations that followed him over the years didn't simply disappear when the news cycle moved on. According to the Bodyguard, those experiences stayed with him. And even when Michael wasn't talking about them directly, their impact could still be felt. Because controversy has a unique way of changing a person's life. It changes how strangers view them. It changes how friends interact with them. It changes how they view themselves. And perhaps most importantly, it changes how much trust they place in others. Trust became a recurring theme throughout Michael's later years. Who genuinely cared? Who was loyal? Who was simply looking for an opportunity? Those questions became increasingly important. Which brings us back to one of the most revealing parts of the Bodyguard's interview. His comments about who was actually present in Michael's life. Because when he reflected on Michael's inner circle, he didn't list dozens of celebrities. He didn't describe endless visitors coming and going. Instead, he spoke about how surprisingly few people were truly around. That's a remarkable statement considering Michael Jackson's level of fame. Most people assume global superstars are constantly surrounded by friends, industry insiders, and celebrities. But according to the Bodyguard, reality looked very different. The circle was much smaller, much quieter, much more selective. And that reality may explain why Chris Tucker's friendship stood out so strongly. The Bodyguard wasn't impressed by public tributes after Michael's death. He was impressed by people who were present before it. People who showed up when cameras weren't rolling. People who visited without publicity. People who maintained genuine relationships. In his view, that's what friendship looked like. Not speeches. Not headlines. Not public appearances. Consistency. Loyalty. Presence. And perhaps that's why his funeral became such an emotional experience. Because funerals have a way of revealing things. They bring together people from every chapter of someone's life. Close friends. Family members. Former colleagues. Acquaintances. Supporters. Critics. Everyone arrives carrying their own memories. Their own version of the person being remembered. For the Bodyguard, that day wasn't simply about mourning Michael Jackson. It was also about reflecting on everything he had witnessed throughout the years. The highs. The lows. The victories. The struggles. The public celebrations. And the private battles. All of it came rushing back. And as he looked around the room, he couldn't help noticing the contrast between public perception and private reality. The world knew Michael Jackson, the icon, the performer, the superstar, the king of pop. But very few people knew Michael Jackson, the person. The man struggling to sleep. The man spending nights alone in a studio. The man searching for peace. The man trying to cope with relentless public scrutiny. According to the Bodyguard, That's the Michael Jackson many people never saw. And perhaps that's why he feels so strongly about correcting misconceptions. Because from his perspective, history often remembers headlines more than humanity. It remembers controversy more than context. It remembers accusations more than emotions. But the people closest to someone often remember something entirely different. They remember conversations. They remember routines. They remember struggles. They remember moments no camera ever captured. And those private moments can paint a very different picture. The Bodyguard's reflections don't erase public debates. Nor do they answer every question surrounding Michael Jackson's life. But they do provide a rare glimpse into how one insider viewed the man behind the global phenomenon. A man he says was deeply misunderstood. A man who turned to music when sleep wouldn't come. A man who valued genuine friendship. And a man whose impact continues reaching millions long after his final performance. But perhaps the most emotional part of the story isn't what happened during Michael Jackson's life. It's what happened after it ended. Because years later, people are still debating who Michael Jackson really was. And the people who knew him best continue sharing memories that challenge everything the public thought it knew. What those memories reveal next may be even more surprising. What those memories reveal next may be even more surprising. Because as time passes, something fascinating continues to happen. Instead of fading from public conversation, Michael Jackson remains one of the most talked about figures in entertainment history. Years after his passing, documentaries are still being made. Interviews are still being conducted. Books are still being written. And perhaps most importantly, people who were actually there continue coming forward with their own experiences. The Bodyguard believes that's because Michael Jackson was never a simple person to understand. To some, he was the greatest entertainer who ever lived. To others, he remains one of the most controversial celebrities in history. And somewhere between those two extremes exists the man that only a small group of people truly knew. A man whose life was far more complicated than most headlines ever suggested. Looking back now, the Bodyguard says one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming they know everything about Michael based on what they saw in public. But public appearances only tell part of the story. The cameras captured concerts, award shows, press conferences, interviews, but they didn't capture the quiet moments. They didn't capture the sleepless nights. They didn't capture the long hours spent creating music while the rest of the world slept. And they certainly didn't capture the emotional weight that came with living under constant scrutiny. Imagine spending years watching strangers debate your life. Imagine seeing your name in headlines day after day. Imagine knowing millions of people have opinions about you without ever meeting you. That kind of pressure would affect almost anyone. According to the Bodyguard, Michael carried that pressure for years. Yet despite everything, he continued creating. He continued dreaming. And he continued believing in the power of music. That's one of the reasons the Bodyguard becomes emotional when discussing Michael's legacy. Because he believes many people focus on the controversies while overlooking the impact Michael had on millions around the world. Whether someone was listening to his music in New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, or Johannesburg, the effect was often the same. People felt connected. People felt inspired. People felt understood. And that connection is still visible today. Even younger generations, who were not alive during Michael's peak years, continue discovering his music. His songs continue reaching new audiences. His performances continue going viral. His influence continues appearing in artists across multiple genres. Very few entertainers achieve that kind of lasting impact. In fact, some would argue Michael Jackson's cultural influence has become larger after his death than it was during certain periods of his life. And that's what makes the Bodyguard's observations so powerful. Because they don't come from a journalist. They don't come from a fan. They don't come from someone watching from a distance. They come from someone who was there. Someone who witnessed the private side of Michael Jackson. Someone who saw the difference between public perception and personal reality. And when he reflects on those years, one message keeps surfacing again and again. Michael Jackson was misunderstood. Not perfect. Not flawless. Not beyond criticism. But misunderstood. The Bodyguard believes many people reduced Michael's entire life to a handful of headlines while ignoring the countless moments that defined who he was as a person. Moments of generosity. Moments of creativity. Moments of friendship. Moments that never made newspaper front pages. Perhaps that's why Chris Tucker's name remains so important in this story. Because when discussing Michael's life, the Bodyguard repeatedly returns to the idea of genuine relationships. Not publicity. Not fame. Not appearances. Real friendship. According to him, Chris Tucker represented something increasingly rare in Michael's world. Authenticity. Someone who maintained a connection without needing attention. Someone who showed up because he cared. Not because cameras were watching. And in many ways, that single detail says a lot about Michael's life. For a man surrounded by millions of admirers, genuine friendships may have been more valuable than almost anything else. Because fame can attract people. But trust is much harder to earn. As the years passed, Michael became one of the most recognizable faces on earth. Yet according to those closest to him, he still searched for the same things ordinary people search for. Peace. Loyalty. Understanding. Connection. Those desires are universal. They don't disappear simply because someone becomes famous. And perhaps that's what makes Michael Jackson's story so compelling. Beneath the record sales. Beneath the sold-out stadiums. Beneath the global fame. There was still a human being trying to navigate life the best way he could. A man who struggled. A man who succeeded. A man who inspired millions. And a man who remains impossible to ignore. The Bodyguard's memories may not settle every debate surrounding Michael Jackson. In fact, they may raise even more questions. But they do offer something valuable. A perspective from someone who spent years watching one of the world's biggest stars away from the spotlight. And from that perspective, the story looks very different than many people expect. Instead of seeing a larger-than-life icon, he remembers a person. A person who sometimes couldn't sleep. A person who escaped into music when life became overwhelming. A person who valued loyalty. And a person who never stopped believing that music could help heal people. Maybe that's why Michael Jackson's legacy continues enduring after all these years. Not just because of the records he sold. Not just because of the awards he won. Not just because of the performances he delivered. But because people continue finding pieces of themselves in the music he left behind. And while debates about Michael Jackson may never completely disappear, one thing remains undeniable. His voice still fills speakers. His songs still move audiences. His influence still shapes culture. And his story still captivates the world. According to the Bodyguard, that's the Michael Jackson he remembers. Not the headlines. Not the rumors. Not the public spectacle. But the man behind it all. A man he believes was deeply misunderstood. And whether people agree or disagree, those who knew Michael personally continue sharing stories that reveal a side of him the world rarely got to see. A side that remains just as fascinating today as it was during his lifetime. And perhaps that is why the conversation about Michael Jackson never truly ends. Because long after the spotlight fades, the questions remain. Who was Michael Jackson really? The world may never fully agree on the answer. But for those who stood closest to him, the memories speak for themselves. What do you think? Was Michael Jackson one of the most misunderstood celebrities in history? Or do you believe the public already knows the full story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the stories behind the world's biggest celebrities.